And we are live, I think. Lovely. Welcome, everyone. My name is Jess. I am one of the Lighthouse team members. And this event was meant to be in person, but the weather has worked against us today. So although Laura Jean McKay is here in Edinburgh, all the way over from Australia, we are sitting in different flats in Edinburgh. So we're closer to each other geographically, but not in the same room. We do live stream all of our events for access reasons, but it would have been really lovely to see people in person. But I'm really, really grateful for everyone who has shown up and is safe in their houses and tuning in with us today. Just a couple of words before we get started, which at Lighthouse we wanted to tell you about, is that the bookshop was closed today as part of the proposed general strike for Palestinian solidarity. And at Lighthouse, we urge everyone to seek out works by Palestinian writers and to support the movement for boycott, divestment and sanctions. Thank you so much for coming. We are here today with the tremendous writer, Laura Jean McKay, who's here all the way from Australia. Just a few words of introduction. So Laura Jean McKay is the author of The Animals in That Country, which is a novel which was the winner of the Arthur C. Clarke Award in 2021, but also the Victorian Prize for Literature and the ABIA Small Publishers Adult Book of the Year. She's the author of Holiday in Cambodia, which was published in 2013. And her new book, which we're here to talk about today, is the collection of short stories called Gunflower. And at this point is where I would say huge applause for Laura Jean McKay. So I'm just going to do it by myself. Welcome to Edinburgh, Laura. It's really, really lovely to speak to you. We spoke on the phone earlier today, so it's like, I know what your voice sounds like, but now I also see your face, which is lovely. So welcome. How have you found it today?
I mean, it is a wild introduction to this beautiful city, but I just hope that everyone is safe. And as we were saying on the phone today, Jess, this is what it's like. Publishing and just being in catastrophic times. We think that life can just go on normally, but here we are.
Exactly, and like I was saying as well earlier, you could have mentioned very briefly that one of the things that I find really striking in all of these stories, I think, is this very stark sort of juxtaposition between intimate spaces and what lies outside of them. And, these intimate spaces could be domestic, but it could also be like a ship where people get abortions done because they're not able to do it anywhere else, like in the title story, Gunflower. So I kind of wanted to start there really with our conversation. I wonder what is most interesting to you and perhaps challenging when bridging that gap between the private and the public. And it's a huge question, I know.
It's a big question, and I love that you put it that way because it's not necessarily something I've directly thought about, but I think I am, and I can see that in your work as well. I think we are both looking at the inside and the outside spaces and how we access, what can be secret or what can be, not talked about. And when we're looking at our relationships, especially with the natural world, with other animals, I think there is a lot unspoken there. And so in Gunflower, I think this theme particularly comes out in the short story Porthole, which is about it's set in New Zealand where I lived for a while. And it comes from a time when I was a lecturer, and from my house to get to the university, I needed to go through a series of fields. It wasn't very far away. And I felt like I went through the stages of a cow's life, a cow in captivity. There was the pregnant cow, then there was the cow with the calf, then there were the cows and the mothers separated, and then the little baby calves would grow up, and then finally the final field was so strange. It was there were cows with these red marks painted on their side, and I thought, who has painted targets on the side of these cows that is so messed up. But they're actually portholes for porthole surgery. And so this story is about a man who is struggling in general with life, and he's decided to go back to university, and he finds himself studying cows and looking at a cannulation, a porthole surgery. And I think I describe it as, he talks about the cow's secrets leaking down her side. And I was really fascinated by the idea of a cow, with a very complex and beautiful digestive system. And she herself never gets to see that, but this man opens the door and sees inside the cow and sees her secrets. So to me, that sort of is the metaphor for the inside and outside relationship that we have with animals. We really do. Sorry, this is a very intense way to start this talk. Hi, everybody. Let's just go right in. But we do really get to
literally
see the secret insides of other animals all of the time at the supermarket, things that they themselves don't tend to see. And I think that's, I guess it's a metaphor for the way we do access and use the environment. And now, as we're seeing in the middle of Storm Babette, I think the environment is, turning around and showing us what happens when we abuse it in this way.
Well, I think that story is such a great example of something else that I really appreciated about your writing, and that is how it feels very anchored in the like bodily reality, basically, and material reality attached to that. And I wonder how writing for you kind of helps you maybe understand or maybe illuminate that the everyday violence that are so many of our lives depend on, really.
I mean, I think I do need to write in order to try to understand the world. People have been asking me a little bit lately who I write for, who is my audience, and it sounds quite egotistical, but I think I do write for myself, or so that I can interpret the world in a slower pace. I move quite slowly, and I write very slowly, and to me the world is just coming at us like a freight train, especially if you're attached to social media and things like I am. And so writing is such a way to slow down and try to access those big hard subjects. I can talk about abortion and the abuse of animals and patriarchy in ways that are a little bit slower, a little bit more comprehensible. And I'm trying, I suppose, to reach out to other people who are grappling with these topics as well, and just saying, slow down, read this story, have it contemplate some of these bigger subjects in a way that isn't like this.
It gives you the chance to actually figure out what you think about things, doesn't it?
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Would you read a little bit for us from one of the stories?
I'd love to. Thank you.
Thank you.
And this one goes out to my family who have come up to Scotland from Australia via London, and I was just talking to my sister-in-law. They're watching in another house in Edinburgh as well, where they're riding out the storm. This one, I was just talking to my sister-in-law Rachel about this one today. I'm just reading a little bit of it, and I'll just let you know what it's about, because unless you're actually reading along, it can be a little tricky. So it's about chickens. It's about chickens. It's called Those Last Days of Summer. That summer stretched year-long, and we were always giving birth. We tried to make a game of it at first, taking turns in the narrow cells and pitching our cries like songs. But towards the end, we were either just fat or skin. The cells formed a long hall, lit 16 hours a day, and always the same, a fearsome golden light coming from the roof, particles of skin floating through the air, in our throats, our faces, the sisters above us and the sisters below. We were all born to the cell, and none of us, not our mothers or their mothers before that, really knew if there was anything but the slanting cage floor, our cellmates, the heat. One of us had heard stories, though, said there was something more than standing and death. What is it? We asked her. Winter, she said. And what else? Darkness. One of us had seen her sister die not 2 cells over, sensed the familiar life coming to an end, and it gave her such a shock that her toes clenched over the bars of the floor. They couldn't get her loose. One thought of us all as sisters and rubbed her raw skin against the bleeding cage when another passed away. The guards would bring in someone new, and after a while, she'd forget and call her sister too. Some of us didn't care, were beyond caring. We felt the rage of the endless day beat like wings that we bit and scratched at. When she fell, we stood on her, flattening her head onto the bruising bars. When we gave birth, it was over her body, even though she'd passed days before. We had our teeth removed and our arms made useless, so all we could do was stand and eat slop with our faces. We stood the long day round. Our bodies grew fat and our legs weak, and we collapsed on each other. We gave birth again and again. In the last days, the giddy, heady urge to birth slowed and then stopped, and we shed hair instead. It fell down through the top cells and covered those below. To punish us, they stopped the food and turned out the lights, and we were plunged into winter. During that time, we told each other things. One said the children we made were sent to war in 3 armies, the 600, 700 or 800 divisions, depending on their size. There were rumours of special units called roasters or broilers. None of them ever returned. It's up there.
Thank you. That story is so powerful, and I feel like even more powerful just hearing you read it. What happens to you? I wasn't planning to ask this, but what happens to you when you read a story out loud, your own work?
Oh, that's such an interesting question. I mean, I guess you get to relate to a piece in a different way, which is why, spoken word is, such a long tradition in most cultures. But it is something I think that can get a little lost in prose writing. We don't get the chance to read out loud very much, and I think it adds another voice to the fiction or the piece in a way.
Yeah, no, go on. Sorry.
Oh, so with my novel, The Animals in That Country, I really fought to be able to do the audiobook. And I think they actually gave me the gig in the end because it's filled with animal voices and nobody else could do all the animal voices. So I got to do it. And it was such an incredible way to engage with a text that I'd been working on for, 7+ years, all, on the screen. And suddenly I had to work out how to speak like a horse. And how to voice a mosquito. And so I called my partner. The plague was coming, by the way. COVID had started and I was over in Sydney, and I called my partner and said, how do I do this? And he said, well, remember, we used to do performance. So just, do performance with your face. So I was in the audio booth stretching my cheeks and putting pens in my mouth, and just not to try to find voices that were non-human, but not in a kitschy way. So, I didn't do sexy cat voices and lovey-dovey dog voices. I was trying to find something that sounded otherworldly. So I suppose when I'm reading, especially in the collective voice of chickens in a battery cage, I'm trying, although I barely could, to imagine what it's like to live so collectively, but under such intense conditions. It takes you to a place.
Yeah, well, I mean, you mentioned the animals in that country there, and it definitely seems like the decentering of I guess some kind of human experience. And the question is like, is there such a thing? Because we're also very different and live under such different circumstances. But it does seem like something that keeps coming up for you. And it's often said that like all writers have these like core kind of questions that we keep coming back to. Do you think that is one of yours? Is it still with you, that sort of trying to make human experience strange or like other in a way, to be able to see what the alternative is, I suppose?
It is increasingly. I mean, I think most of my writing is either about relationships or power, and the power in relationships. And so talking about the more than human world is such a perfect way to look at how power operates in our relationships with other species, but also with each other. I'm really fascinated by the idea of power. It's often seen in a negative way, but you know, were we together live with a group of people, there would be a certain power dynamic happening. You know, we would be up the front of the room, we would be talking, everybody else would be listening, we would be sort of taking that power, and hopefully in a positive way. But it happens in every single interaction we have. And I was really you know, interested when I was researching other animals for Gunflower and for the animals in that country. I would go on a lot of walks. I love walking. So this morning I walked up to Arthur's seat, which was pretty blustery.
Yeah.
And I saw some, you know, cool birds that I'd never seen before. But I love walking in Australia, and there's a moment where you hear a marsupial in the bush, and you stop and you see, you know, the face of a wallaby or the face of a kangaroo or an echidna, and you stop. And for me, it's such a beautiful experience. It's so exciting, you know. For them, it's a moment of life or death. You know, that animal is the one that's been sent out from the rest of the mob or the group, and they're watching you to see what you're going to do and whether you're going to cause danger to the rest of their family. And so that split absolutely fascinates me. For me, it's the best moment of my day. For the kangaroo, it's the worst. How do we overcome, you know, this very confusing and complex situation that is living on this planet together? And that comes down to human interactions as well. You know, especially coming from a colonized country and being of colonial stock and settler stock myself. You know, that's a place that I think a lot of people in Australia are always thinking about that very, very violent interaction.
Well, it also makes me want to ask you about something else. You know, at least here in the UK, I feel like still, even though there's been so much talk about how climate and environmental justice is social justice, and that they aren't separate, there is still, at least in mainstream media and kind of mainstream conversations, this kind of division about, like, we talk about the natural world here and so preserving the environment, whatever that means, and social justice over here, and the people who are most affected by actual environmental degradation. And I'm just really curious to hear how, if that is familiar to you where you are, and how that kind of translates to an Australian environmental justice conversation, and what that looks like at the moment.
I think I could be wrong, but I think Australia is one of the more sort of urbanized, even though I think, you know, if you haven't been to Australia, it's seen as this big sort of wide natural space, you know, with emus running across it. But, you know, I think we're extremely urbanized. A lot of people do live in the cities, you know, around the green edges. And, you know, so we do have a strange relationship with the environment, because I think it's very much our identity, this massive and very diverse landscape of different weather systems. And us, you know, many people gathered around the edges, sort of safe in the cities, but the environment is coming to us. We flood increasingly, we're on fire increasingly. There's a really, really amazing essay by Jane Rawson, who writes really beautifully on extinction. And she wrote that we think that the wildlife is just out there for us to go and see, or it just exists in its wild space. And if we wanted to go and see it, we could go see it. And she said, it's not there anymore, not in the abundance that it used to be. The fish are not there. Australia has the dubious distinction of being one of the biggest countries of extinction in the world. So these beautiful animals that we're known for in these green spaces, they're not there really anymore. or if they're there, they're becoming degraded. The Great Barrier Reef is becoming bleached, for example. So I think even though we have perhaps tried to ignore these things, they are coming to us and becoming very prevalent. And a lot of writers are reflecting this. I've noticed that a lot of Australian authors anyway, but I think this could be a global thing. Over the last 10 years particularly, there's a lot of climate fiction, a lot of speculative writers addressing these issues. When people are writing gritty realism, they have to put pandemic and the environment in these novels about perhaps more domestic and intimate spaces, because it's just there. We can't ignore it.
Yeah. There's like that comfortable bubble is an illusion for sure. I mean, you mentioned the word speculative there, and I did want to ask you a wee bit about, I guess, genre, or for lack of a better word. One of the things that I love about stories like Gunflower, which, for those of you who haven't had the chance to read the book, is a story about a ship where people who are pregnant and in need of an abortion can go out and do that there, and it's outside of basically US state territory, I suppose. And one of the things that I really love about that story is that it's not a dystopia. It's not kind of this terrible thing is going to happen in the future. It's just reality, because it reflects the reality of a lot of people at the moment. So I kind of wanted to ask you about how you navigate that, like the need to sort of look at what could happen with the need to just describe what is happening. And how, especially with these stories, which some of them are, I suppose, what people would call speculative.
I found myself in a strange situation, as many of us did during the pandemic, where I was reading two books. One was Ling Ma's Severance, which is about a zombie plague in New York. And the other one was Ronnie Scott's The Adversary, which is about a group of young queer men in Melbourne. One very much speculative or science fiction, the other one very much realist. And during the pandemic, I found myself reading Severance, the plague book, as a manual for how to cope with living in a pandemic. And I read The Adversary, the gritty realist one, as almost a nostalgia piece, because this was a Melbourne, where I've lived for a long time, that I couldn't access. I was trapped in New Zealand. I couldn't get back, and most of the people I knew were very much locked inside. This was not a story that was real anymore. So that became a nostalgic sort of historical piece, and the futuristic piece was our current apocalypse. So I think our relationship with speculative fiction, and my relationship with speculative fiction, has changed a lot. In Gunflower, that's a story I've been trying to write for a long time. I wanted to write it as a novel. I'd spent some time traveling on cargo ships between Australia and New Zealand, and found myself in this very, very masculine environment, and wondered what it would be like if it was, a ship crewed by women, or a ship crewed by non-binary people. What would that look like? And I realized, I knew that it was an abortion ship. I'm not sure why, these things just happen to you as a fiction writer. And I'd looked at the work of women on waves. So, this is very much a real thing. There are ships in the world who go around to territories where people can't access, where their reproductive rights have been taken away, or they've never been able to access them adequately. And, people do board these ships and get access to these services. But I still wasn't sure how to write it. And then in America, Roe versus Wade happened, and the access to abortion, was overturned. And even though it was happening in the States, it just seemed like a story that could be told through this mode. And even though it is slightly speculative in that, there's an abortion ship sort of lost at sea, trying to find, I suppose, its political and physical place in the world. It seems to me, this is the reality for a lot of people around the world. Even though we've been lucky enough to have access to these rights in Australia for a long time. This is very much not the case for so many people. Yeah.
You mentioned that pandemic there, and I wondered if how these last few years that we've all lived through, if that's changed your idea of what isolation means at all, because it can be comfort as well as, isolation in a negative way. I feel like sometimes we can use isolation as a way of not looking at reality, or kind of keeping the blinds there, that sort of thing. So how has it been for you? Has it changed your idea of what it means at all?
I mean, I suppose as a prose writer, I spend a lot of time isolated anyway, either physically or in my head. I'm really lucky to know a lot of writers now that I can connect with, but there is a certain comfort in that world of being an artist, working for a long time on something. I suppose the pandemic, I mean, I'm very cynical, and anyone who's read my work or looks at it now will know that I don't necessarily think that humans are so great. I think we don't learn from our mistakes. I was standing next to the castle today talking about this with my mum and my stepdad, who are watching now, about history and the way we repeat ourselves just over and over again. So there was a funny thing, you'll probably remember, when the pandemic started, that that nature is healing, and me and my partner still say this. We'll see a flower growing up through rubbish and go, oh look, nature is healing.
Yeah.
Because there was this idea that humans would actually learn to become quiet. We would stop using cars and transport and polluting the world, and the deer would run back through the city, and there would be a rewilding. And then of course when lockdowns became less and less, we all just went back.
And whilst people were dying in hospitals,
Right.
Yeah.
That's right. And I mean, look at me, I am on, having flown to the other side of the world, at the first chance I could get. So I think we are nothing if repetitive. And we could learn a lot from other species in how to just sort of maybe care for kin, and make some more space for each other.
And yet, we try, and we have to try. And I was just thinking now that this would be a really nice time for those who kind of aren't aware, that I was going to ask about your earrings that you're wearing today.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Yes. Thank you. So these earrings say yes, and they're in Indigenous colours, Indigenous Australian colours of red and black and yellow, which is very much the colours of Australia. Really, a lot of the country reflects this. And so in Australia, we've just had a vote, a referendum to establish a voice in our parliament. And the voice was an advisory body of Indigenous people who would have a say and give advice on matters that affected them. There was a lot of hope that the referendum would go through, but unfortunately a large percentage of the population of Australia voted no. There was some really terrible media campaigns, some terrible movements from opposition, and a very strong feeling of fear, that possibly comes after times of fear and economic and housing crisis. But we have been asked to continue, wearing these colours beyond the referendum, because of course that was just one small step towards, I hope now it's yes to treaty. So we have, millions of people, possibly 8 million people who voted yes. That's a lot of people. So, if 8 million people work now towards treaty or another form of advisory or body, then there's a lot of strength there.
Brilliant. Well, thank you for telling us about that. So yeah, for those of you who are want to learn more, there's there's places to go and to learn more about that.
Yeah.
I wanted, before we have another reading from a different story in the book, I wanted to ask you a little bit more about the actual birth of the book. You know, I'm one of those people. It's a weird thing, but I always read the acknowledgements in pretty much every book
Yes, I
I read. I just find it really fascinating. Sometimes I might read the acknowledgement before I actually read the book, which is quite weird. But anyway, in the acknowledgement, you mentioned how some of the stories have been kind of in the making for 2 decades, which I thought was really quite fascinating. Well, partly because they feel so urgent, all of them. So I was just curious to hear you talk a little bit more about that, and if there was, in the process of actually putting everything together into a collection that is meeting its readers now, if there were any really surprising moments for you.
Mm-mm. So yeah, it was it's such an amazing process to put together, a body of work that's been coming for so long. And I went back through every file I ever had to see what I'd written and where I'd come from. It was quite confronting. In some places, I found stories that I wouldn't be able to write now, and I wouldn't necessarily want to write now, but there was some sort of youthful spark there that I just really loved, and I was really proud of the person that I was, 15 years ago, writing these sorts of stories. In other cases, there were stories that were just so terrible and just unbelievably awful. And, I'd been sending some of these stories, to the New Yorker, to Granta. Here's my stories about 2 women picking blueberries.
But that's good though, isn't it? Because I mean, how terrible would it be if you looked back at the things you'd written like 20 years ago and everything was amazing? Then, where have you been doing?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. Why aren't I, a superstar? But, and it is really nice. And I think, this happens with a lot of emerging writers in that, we have these moments of spark where things just come out well. And at other times it's just mud. And sometimes the stuff can be rescued from the mud or cleared off and made into something new. And there were cases where I did see sparks of stories in the mud, and I turned them into something new for Gunflower. And other cases they just had to go. But organizing the stories was quite interesting. I came up with this fairly lofty idea that I would organize them into birth, life, and death, and that was really just a placeholder thing so that I could comprehend where I was coming from and the big themes that I was working with. But in the end, it ended up being like this. And I realized, because that's the thing that connects us all as living beings. We are all born, we all we all live, and we all die. And in this time of global crisis, it is good to remember that everybody who is alive goes through these experiences. It was important to me to have these bigger themes so that I could place these moments into this space. And it was also a really good chance to do an epigraph from my father, who passed away. He was 27 just before I was born, and my brother was 5 and my mum was 24. And the last poem that he wrote in hospital begins, if life were not so fragile, death not so permanent. So that's Ross McKay in 1977. And I realized that, there were no lines in the world that were more perfect for this collection than from my poet father. So that was really beautiful to be able to.
I'm so glad that you told us about that. I did wonder about that lovely, lovely epigraph.
Okay.
Yeah, that's brilliant.
Yeah.
I also wanted to ask you about, because and I think that it'll relate to the bit that you're about to read now for a second rereading. And we've kind of touched on this a little bit, with the animal voices and stuff. there's a wonderful, wonderful humor in the books, which I think a lot of people have picked up on when reading your writing. And it is also very, very poignant. How do you relate to humor? Because I feel like there's all these quite thorny questions around what humor does, that it can be used to like soften things, but maybe that's not what we want to do. We might not want to soften things. And I don't think it does that in your writing. So what is it for you?
Mm. I think, fundamentally, I am very cynical. I don't really have much hope, but I do have a lot of love. I realize for me, it's about love rather than hope. And love is hard, when you're in a relationship with other people or the world, there's ups and downs. You have to work hard at it. But also being in a relationship with the world is funny. And
Yeah.
I think one of the joys of our relationship with other animals particularly is that often other animals are very, very funny. And, I think about a kookaburra, which is an Australian bird, the one that laughs. I remember a kookaburra coming down to where I was living, and I was eating some nuts, and it wanted some of those nuts and took some from my hand, and then there were none left. And I was laughing at the bird because it had a really sort of disgruntled sort of demeanor. It's fluffed up its feathers. And so the bird just grabbed my hand and started trying to fly backwards with it, taking off with my hand. And I was just crying with laughter. And it could only have been a joke. It was just this kookaburra going, damn you, there's no nuts. I'm taking off with your body. I'm going to take it up into a tree and eat it, And, we don't get these moments with other humans necessarily. We do laugh with each other, but there are these interactions with, the natural world. Me, screaming on the top of a peak at Arthur's Seat this morning as the wind, belted at me so hard I was nearly choking. That's funny. That's fun. That's an amazing experience.
I love what you said about humor coming from love. That's great. I think there's a lot in that for sure. Will you read another excerpt from the book for us? And I should say as well, because it's kind of slowly coming to that time, that if you are sitting at home watching and you feel like you have a question, please just pop it in the chat on the website where you're watching the event, and then we will get that fed through, and Laura will answer your question. So if you're sitting on something, now is kind of the time to start working on it, making it into a question. Thank you.
Thank you. So this is called Real. Craig Henderson, you are the most attractive real estate agent in the region. When 47-year-old Jessica and I see your sign on the highway, on the bus station, above the takeaway, we think about retirement. We tuck our chippies in our jackets and remember the time we saw you at the fancy New World. Jessica told you your own name, and I said how we never see you at Pack and Save. You inclined your head, just like on the poster. We looked to see if savings fell out. You're set back from the road, Craig Henderson. You're close to schools, shops, and amenities. You've got a good heat pump, Craig Henderson, Jessica whispers into the drizzled air at the bus stop billboard. The sign reads, Get Ahead, and Jessica scratches Job into the perspex over your face with the key to our share house. If we don't, someone who doesn't understand you will. And Craig Henderson, we have questions. Are you perfect for a family? Are you a first-time dream or an opportunity to upsize? Will we have no regrets? We've pooled our money. After the chips, we have $15.30 in the hand and $943 in the bank. But how much do you want, Craig Henderson? Your golden hands, your reflective face. Our jackets stink of hot oil, but they're warm.
Amazing, thank you. I love that story. That actually makes me want to ask. So that is one of the really short stories in the book, and there's quite a few of these kind of half a page, really short ones. Now that you've been, we were talking about the span of time of working with the book. do those short stories come, very short ones, come from a particular time, or have you always kind of dipped into these tiny format ones?
Oh no, the short stories were so freeing because as a younger writer, I was writing to publish desperately, and so everything was 1,500 words or 3,000 words because that's what publications in Australia and possibly here publish. So once I realized I was doing a collection and my publisher loved the idea, I just branched my wings and wrote very long stories like Gunflower and Smoko, and very, very short ones like the one I just read. And there's one that is 2 lines long. And it was so cool to be able to access these tiny moments, these thoughts that I'd had that, I don't want to get too woo-woo or magical about it, but I think stories do kind of tell you what they want, what length they want to be, what voice they want to be in, what perspective, if you do enough edits and drafting and listen to them. But often you can't work to that, especially if you're starting out, because you need to publish or someone's commissioned you to do something. So you have to work to spec. So Gunflower was just such a just powerful sort of freedom for me to be able to say, this is my book. I am going to write whatever the hell I want, and
I can write a 2-line story, and that is perfect.
That's right.
Yeah. That's brilliant. Do we have any questions? We might just check in now and see if there are any questions. Otherwise, I have many more. I think Christina might feed them through, so we're going to give people a few more moments. I wanted to ask you, going back to what you just said about stories being what they need to be, or the length they need to be. And this is one of the really big questions that I really wanted to ask you. One of the things that I really find difficult, especially at the moment, and that I struggle with just sitting down to write at any moment, is that the world is on fire. And so it feels like everything is urgent, and everything is urgent to think about and to figure out and to try and push for certain things with that love that I've been talking about. But at the same time, fiction takes time, and stories take the time that they need. And there is so much politics in Gunflower, and there is so much thinking about the world around us. So how do you manage that balance between needing to say things, but also allowing the story to say what it needs to say?
So I come from a very literary fiction background, even though I didn't study literature. It's very much about realism and character-driven stories, with journeys and plot and voice and whatnot. But I got in trouble in my writing groups when I was younger for wearing my politics too much on my sleeve, for being too obvious about what I wanted to say. And so it's actually been quite a release to just go there now, with the way I feel about the world, but to have that foundation in character-driven stories and in voice. So in a way, I often feel like I'm writing 2 stories, especially if I'm writing speculative fiction or stories that that bridge sort of the humans and other animals divide. In the one way, I'm always looking at very literary stories, and I'm quite a conventional writer. I often start at the start, even though people think my stuff is bizarre. If you really looked at it, I start at the start, there's a middle, and then there's an ending. There's not much clever flipping around for me. There's dialogue. It's usually in talking marks, it's pretty standard, but then thematically, I feel like within that little circle, I can just go wild. And that's where I really like to push things in terms of content rather than craft.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. That is, you said, people think that it's bizarre. And I know there's a quote on the back saying it's full of the absurd.
Yes.
Do you enjoy, do you enjoy reading things that are so-called absurd? Because I feel like it's weird what the words that other people attach to your writing that you might not actually identify with yourself, you know.
Absolutely. There was a word that that Scribe was going to use on the back cover, and I couldn't remember. I can't remember what it is, but I asked them to remove it. It was sort of because it was bizarre or wild, you know, and you know, they were happy to remove it. But you know, because I said people are going to come at this with their own words like kaleidoscopic. You know, I don't need to tell them that. Because I don't think that my writing is bizarre or weird. It's just the way I see the world. It seems quite normal to me. But I also
it's very realistic, I think, for sure. It makes sense you saying that you're from a kind of literary realism background, because that makes sense. It's the world that is absolutely bonkers.
Yeah, and that's what I love, you know, so much about, you know, reading your book, How We Are Translated, in that it is, I don't know, you're managing this sort of very bizarre world in the domestic space, and people are having very strange conversations, but it's so driven by this very heartfelt, warm and funny characterization. So that's really the stuff that I read, I think. You know, I don't really go so much into weird fiction, though I know there's some very exciting work being done in those spaces. You know, but people writing like Deborah Levy, you know, Will Self, Suniti Namjoshi, who's a writer. If you haven't come across her work, her work with talking animals, particularly The Conversations of a Cow, which is a philosophical love story between a cow and a woman. Just brilliant work. And again, you know, very character driven, even though she's going into some strange spaces.
Well, that actually, I've just realized that we have some questions in the chat, and that actually answers one of them.
Oh.
Because it was someone saying, I really connected with your experience of reading Severance, and part of my question is somehow covered over the Melbourne story. I wondered, what are you reading at the moment, and how is it resonating?
Well, I'm reading Jessica's How We Are. It's bloody brilliant. But I mean, another book I've been reading is Ned Bauman's Venomous Lump Suckers, which won. Oh, sorry, I've just maximized my chat. Which won the Arthur C. Clarke this last year, and that's so exciting for me because that is, you know, I would call that serious sci-fi, which isn't necessarily a genre that I read heaps of, but you know, the way it sort of lump suckers you into the world and holds you there with this incredible world building and world creation is just really, really exciting to me. So yeah, I'm really enjoying that at the moment.
Great. We have another question, which is, what advice do you have for a new speculative fiction writer?
That's such a good question. Especially because in a way I'm a new speculative fiction writer as well. You know, it wasn't a space I thought I'd be working in. I wasn't sure if the sci-fi community would even, you know, allow me, you know, and I you know, because there's such incredible voracious readers and such a strong community, but they've been really, really welcoming. So one piece of advice is to, you know, find your writer people who are writing in the same way as you, because it is a very supportive community. But another thing I'd say, especially with speculative fiction, and this comes down to the world building I was just talking about, is that if you're writing a speculative fiction story, you are writing two stories. You're writing a realist story set in this world. So I would say you have to really have your realism, you know, down pat and think about texture and voice and describing, you know, the scene, you know, and finding who is going to tell your story and why. You know, representation really comes in there as well. Are you the person to tell this story? Things like that, political aspects. You also are writing a story where there's phenomenal, strange, new, bizarre, non-existent things happening in this world. So you have to have your world building down pat, and world building is hard because you're creating things from scratch. In the realist world, you can wander around a city, like I've been doing today, because I'm writing, my next novel is speculative, wandering around a city, looking at you know, smelling things, listening to the sound of my feet on the pavement, listening to the texture of people's voices. But when the speculative thing comes in, suddenly, a storm comes that turns, everything blue. You need to work out how you're going to describe that. So take your time. Don't let anyone rush you. This is hard. You're doing two things and they need to thread together. And if you can nail it, it's a really, really exciting thing. And if you don't nail it, it's an absolute mess. So
that's such a great piece of advice, though, definitely, about that almost double vision. And I wonder if that actually applies to a lot of different genres and not just speculative fiction as well.
Yeah, I wonder. Yeah, I mean, genre writing, so interesting to cross over into if you haven't worked in that area before. There's a lot of rules.
Speaking about genre, and you wrote the previous one was a novel. This is a short story collection. You said you're just writing a novel now. Reading short stories is one of those things that not everyone does it, and there's this idea that sometimes it can be difficult to invite people into or whatever, or that lots of writers read short stories but no one else, and all these kind of ideas around it. Have you read short stories for a really long time? What does that relationship look like, and who are your favorite short story writers?
Yeah, I have been reading short stories, for as long as I remember, and I remember arriving at the University of Melbourne to study creative writing. I'd already, done another degree, but finally I was sort of getting to do what I wanted to do. And I went into the library and I came across this book. It was sort of sitting out, and it was Janet Frame's The Lagoon and Other Stories. So Janet Frame is a New Zealand writer, very, very famous for her work, which is brilliant, but also because she was misdiagnosed and put into an institution, and she was about to undergo a lobotomy. And the night before her operation, she won one of the biggest awards in New Zealand. The head of the hospital saw the news and came in and said, "I don't think we'll be giving you that operation. You can." You're released, go off and write. And, her work is so thrilling and so realist, but in such a strange way. And it just gave me chills. It helped me to see that there are these people in the world who aren't like everybody else, but it doesn't mean that they should, be, institutionalized or treated in a certain way. It means they're really trying to access the world through art. That was very exciting to me. There's a few Australian writers whose work really speaks to me. I'm interested. I like the stylists, I guess. And I'd say Janet Frame works in that way. Tony Birch is another author, an Indigenous author in Australia, who, if you haven't come across his work, it's really fantastic. And more recently, Ellen van Neerven is another Indigenous Australian writer, and she writes a story called Water in her collection Heat and Light, which is basically about plant people falling in love, and it's so wild and like nothing I've ever read before. But I have been thinking about short stories and what you're saying, Jess, about why people read them or don't, or what they mean. And I was thinking that a novel is like a one-on-one cup of tea with someone, with an old friend, and you just really get down to, your relationships and what's happening and the real deep sort of guts of each other is novel reading. And a short story collection, I think, is more like a party. So you enter the room and there's a lot of noise and it's quite, intense, and you're trying to get a drink and you see a friend over there, and then maybe you duck out and go to the bathroom and just go, okay, yeah. Like, no, this is fun. And get back out there and get into it. So, it is a very different experience. It can feel hectic, but I think ultimately it's very exciting to delve into a short story collection. And recently I've started a short story book club, because I really struggle with book clubs. You read books that you don't really like, and people are just like, get really drunk and just say, I liked it, or I didn't like it, or I didn't finish it, or, and that's about.
Or just not talk about the book at all.
not talk about the book at all, talk about anything else with the book. It's just a reason to get together, and getting together over art is great. I encourage it. I do it all the time. But we have been choosing one published short story. We meet once a month and we just go through it over an hour. And with a short story, I realized people want to get together and talk about them because you can get into the craft, and you can talk about the entirety of the narrative. You're holding it in that hour together, and it's so much fun, and we come out just buzzing and we can't wait to meet again. So I think actually a short story and maybe, reading things out loud together, we can tap into this sort of collective art experience in a way that we don't necessarily get to do with the personal treatment of a novel.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. And it does explain why I often feel like I have to take breaks in short story collections, because it's like I've had this really intense conversation with someone and I kind of don't want the next thing to just overshadow it just yet. I want to linger with it a little bit longer. So that's when I go off to the bathroom and take a breather.
Right, that's right. Go and have a one-on-one with someone, in a novelistic way, and then get back to
yeah, exactly. If you have any other questions, we're about to we only have a couple of minutes left, so this is your chance. Otherwise, I'm gonna sneak in a last question, and that is going back all the way to where we started with the private and the public and the personal and the political. And I just wanted to ask you, because I'm sure that is very different for you compared to anyone who reads the book. Looking at it now, which story for you in Gunflower is the one that you see as the most political?
I suppose I would say that Gunflower is. I think that the other stories in the collection hang thematically from that work, even because it's dealing with patriarchy, really, and it's dealing with capitalism and sort of the end of the world, and it is about birth and life and death. I think that the collection needed that story as the ship to guide it. It is about a ship, but to guide it through, and they hang from that. Probably actually 3 stories do that work in a way. That story, the excerpt I just read, the chicken story, in a way those stories speak to each other in that it's a group of females of their species together in a very intense situation, trying to work things out. And then another story that relates to that is a story called Ranging, which it's about a support group, a domestic violence support group, who finds themselves in a world where all the men have disappeared, and there's a great grief in that, but there's a great complexity because they're in this group together because of the violence they've experienced. And when I was researching this story, I came across a Twitter thread from a long time ago. I think it was an archived one, and someone had said, what would we do? What would we do if the men just disappeared? And there's complexities in that in terms of gender, but I'll just allow me to be binary for a moment, and I apologize for that. What would we do if the men just disappeared? And there was talk about grief and loss and things, but a lot of people were saying, I would just take my top off and run through the streets. I would just be in my body and not have to fear at night. And that's I don't think that's just a female experience. It's the experience for a lot of people who feel that they can't access a lot of areas in the patriarchy, and the night is one that is often claimed by a certain strata of society. And there was just this beautiful moment of thinking about just being able to run with a group of people without fear, semi-clothed, without being sexualized. And yeah, that's an interesting concept to me. For all species. It would cross all species. Wouldn't it be amazing if the cows could just run like their bodies intended them to.
Yeah, without some weird red portholes on their sides. Yeah. Thank you so much, Laura. I think we've run out of time. But it's been, for me, it's been an absolute pleasure, and I've just enjoyed it so very much, and I hope that people at home have as well. And this will be up as a recording on the website, so people can catch up later on. I'm seeing little clappy hands from the Lighthouse account.
Thank you so much for your generosity with these questions. And it's just, this is my first event in the UK, and it's just, it's such an honor to be here and to meet other writers and readers. So thank you everyone for joining, and thank you so much to Lighthouse Books for supporting me and other writers, and also the causes that you do.
Well, hopefully, depending on weather tomorrow, you might be able to pop by. We'll see how that goes.
Let's all
thank
gather
you so
again.
much, and thank you everyone. So I think we're stopping the recording.
Bye.